Thank you all very much for the invitation to join you this afternoon, and thanks in particular to Peter Berkowitz and his team. What I think we're going to be speaking about this afternoon are some very important issues, but I have to be honest with you and say that suddenly all these issues that I'm going to speak about, while I still think they're all important, have suddenly begun to pale into insignificance for me this week with the murder yesterday of one of our very finest members of Parliament, who was killed outside her constituency, and everyone is in a great state of shock. And then, of course, next week, the United Kingdom could vote to withdraw from the European Union, which in my view would be a disaster, but it would be a double disaster because then, in my view, that would then trigger the breakup of the United Kingdom. So we're talking today against a great shadow of gloom and uncertainty, and these are the big issues that will dominate the next few weeks, sadly. But still, whatever happens, the issues we're discussing today are still going to remain important. And what I want to try to do is try to, in about 40 minutes, to try to address three themes together, because I think they all come together in the challenge of smart specialisation, on innovation, on regional development. And I want to briefly run through these themes and then leave the floor to Michaela, and then hopefully to hear what you think about some of these issues. So I'll run through very, very quickly old and new thinking in political economy, the role of the state, of the public animateur, as I call it, run through some classical and contemporary views, apply them to smart specialisation, and then to think about the specific context of lagging regions, because this is where the challenge of cohesion policy, the challenge of smart specialisation is greatest of all in what we call our lagging regions. I want to begin by saying that we need to change the way we speak about the public sector, about the state. And Will Hutton's comment, I think, sums it up, that it's all in the UK today, and for many years, and I also think in the United States, it's almost impossible to have a sensible conversation about the state or the public sector, because the dominant narrative is about shrinking it, fragmenting it, privatizing it, or outsourcing it. It's not about trying to work with it, trying to tap its potential, as it were. And many people who criticize the public sector draw on ideas stretching back to the very beginnings of political economy. And, of course, the founding father of political economy was Adam Smith, for the purposes of this talk. Smith very, very famously said, all you need for a state to move to the highest states of opulence, prosperity, peace and security, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. Three simple things, he said, that the state needs to do, and then you can leave it all to what he called the natural course of things. And by the way, what Smith meant by the natural course of things was what he called the constant and universal human imperative to better our conditions. He said, throughout all time, in all places, regardless of culture, you can rely on the natural course of things. And that is human beings' basic desire to want to better their condition. And they need these three things to do it. It's a myth, I think, and it's worth reminding ourselves this, given the climate that surrounds the public sector and the critique of the state. It's worth remembering that the founding father of political economy never made a plea for pure laissez-faire. He always recognized the need for a judicious government, what I call a smart state. a smart government, a smart public sector. Why? Because he realised, leaving the market to itself, the market, social privilege and the division of labour all created incredible downsides and worked against the general welfare of the population. And for those of you who've not had the joy, shall we say, of reading Smith, I still don't know a better critic of the division of labour. Yes, in The Wealth of Nations, in Book 1, he talks about the phenomenal productivity power of the division of labour. But if you can last the course and get to Book 5, you begin to see that Smith was first and foremost a moral philosopher. He didn't see himself as an economist. He was a moral philosopher. And it's there in Book 5 that you see what you might call the dark side of the division of labour. This prefigures what many people thought sounded like the early Marx. The early Marx writing on alienation. But Smith in Book 5 talks about that the division of labour has a terrible effect on the labouring classes. Why? Because doing one menial task day in, day out renders the labouring poor, he said, as ignorant and as selfish and as stupid as it's possible for a human creature to be. There's never been a more devastating critique of the human conditions of division of labour than in Smith. And that's why he set such a great emphasis on the role of the state and public education. So in Smith, the way I read him anyway, he's not opposed to the state as such. He's opposed to a stupid state that gets in the way, yeah, that's snarled up with bureaucracy. A smart state where states are competent, he's all for giving them a larger mandate. For example, he speaks very well of the city-states of Amsterdam and Venice because they were smart and judicious, vigilant and parsimonious, as he said. Okay, so I say these things simply because it's worth reminding ourselves that in the very founding text of political economy, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, there is a conception there, if you're dispassionate enough to read it, of something that we might today call a smart state. Anyway, let's fast forward nearly 2 centuries. And we come to the, if this will fast forward, it's now stuck. So much for fast forwarding. If we fast forward nearly 2 centuries, we come to the critique. Okay, thank you, Katya. We come to the critique of the state. This is the growth of the state has grown meanwhile, and now we see a neoliberal backlash to the growth of the state, what we might call the neoliberal backlash. There's a political dimension to this which is pretty crude. Less state equals more market. This is what the neoliberal political project of deregulation and privatization is about. It's pretty crude, but it's been popular. But then there's an intellectual dimension to this critique, which I think needs to be taken seriously. And it draws on the work of Hayek. And Hayek is a very, very serious philosopher and economist and can't be dismissed very easily. And there are 2 dimensions of Hayek which we need to remind ourselves whenever we're trying to invest too much faith in the state. It's always worth reminding ourselves of these 2 Hayekian objectives. Number 1, it's about information and knowledge, which Hayek saw as being totally distributed throughout society, and no state could ever command sufficient knowledge, hence his critique of the Soviet Union. The state can never be a substitute for the decentralized processing capacity of the market. If Hayek was here today, he would say, the real strength of capitalism and why it's outcompeted every other system is because capitalism, at its heart, is a decentralized system of trial and error. Things that work take off, things that don't work get dropped. And that's the capitalist mechanism which is very efficient for generating wealth. I'm not talking about the inequities of distribution, but in terms of generating wealth, we have still never come up with something more effective than capitalism. So the state can never substitute for that. And then secondly, industrial policy needs to be treated equally and ideally avoided in Hayek's view. Why? Because industrial subsidies will create false incentives for firms to chase subsidies or lobbying or clientelism rather than innovation. It'll inadvertently promote rent seeking. So when we design policies, we have to be aware of these pitfalls. We have to be aware of these potential downsides. And I think this is that's a healthy position to take. Now, I want to consider 3 critiques of that neoliberal critique before moving on to look at innovation. And I do this simply because these ideas have informed thinking on smart specialization. Dominique Faure, who is the best known architect of smart specialization, draws on all these ideas in different ways. So it's worth us realizing where these ideas actually come from historically. Mariana Mazzucato has written a marvelous book called The Entrepreneurial State. It truly is a first-class read, engaging, compelling in its arguments. It's got some problems, which I want to address. But fundamentally, I think the motivation for this book was absolutely timely. Mazzucato wanted to change the way we talk about the state, to acknowledge some of its positive achievements and not just its shortcomings and its limitations. Change the way we talk about the state, show that the state has been innovative and creative. And to prove that argument, she takes the case of Apple and shows how all the smart technologies that went to make the iPhone were all funded by federal dollars. It's an extraordinary story. But I think there are two worries, shortcomings in the book, the way I read it. Number one, to prove her point about the creativity of the public sector, she takes DARPA, the American Defense Agency, to illustrate how the public sector can be innovative. But DARPA, I think anyone who knows it, is a unique public sector body. It's well staffed with experts. It's got large budgets. It's got a mandate to fail occasionally. And therefore, in all these ways, it's an unusual public sector agency. So that's not the norm, it's the exception. And secondly, the book at the end left me with a feeling that while it was a fabulous read, and largely I agreed with it, there was a tendency to underplay the creativity of Apple and to overplay the creativity of the state. Any company could have used those federal projects to do what Apple did, but only Apple did it. So Apple had the competences to use those public goods and to use it in a highly innovative way. So that's one critique of the neoliberal critique, which is well worth considering. But the most persuasive of all, to my mind, is the work on experimentalist governance by Danny Roderick and also by Chuck Sable. Very, very quickly on each one, and then I'll move on to innovation. Danny Roderick's paper, written for UNIDO originally, was one of the first of many papers where he tried to redesign the principles of a smart industrial policy. And he accepts the Hayek critique that states lack information, but he turns it on its head and says, so does every other agent. Firms also lack information. Every agent is subject to bounded rationality and limited information. And therefore, to overcome that knowledge deficit, that informational deficit, if you will, firms and states need to work together in a trial by error process of experimentation, where the aim is to elicit information about new technologies, about costs, about prices, about user feedback, we do this together, working in concert. And we evaluate the outcomes almost in real time through what Sable calls diagnostic monitoring, which I'll come back to in a moment. These are the ideas that Dominic Foray draws on when he develops his ideas for smart specialisation. Chuck Sable has developed these ideas further. As some of you will remember, those of you who attended the Smart Regions conference in Brussels recently will have heard Chuck Sable talk about his views on experimentalist governance. And, you know, it's a recursive process of provisional goal setting and revision based on learning from different approaches. That's basically the idea. But notice, in the last sentence of the first bullet point, it involves joint goal setting between the central, let's say the Commission, and the local unit, the managing authority in our case, where the local unit has broad discretion to pursue the goals. That's very, very important, it seems to me, because as I'll come back to when we talk about lagging regions, many of the local units in our lagging regions don't enjoy the discretion to pursue their goals. Why? Because they don't enjoy devolved power, a point I'll come back to in a moment. At the heart of Sable's argument, and it's well worth considering the argument, is the idea of embracing diagnostic monitoring, the primary aim of which is to build problem-solving capacity. It's not conventional audit, where we're trying to see if money has been well spent in terms of economy, efficiency, effectiveness. Not conventional audit. This is about building primary problem-solving capacity. And those of you who will remember his argument in Smart Regions will recall that it was quite a dramatic end to the argument, because he said, if we don't embrace more diagnostic monitoring in our smart specialisation strategies, smart specialisation could degenerate into business as usual, was his phrase. My own position, for what it's worth, is that experimental governance is a very compelling argument in principle, but it's incredibly challenging for our public bodies to do in practice. Why? Because from all our work, I've identified three big barriers to experimental governance and to public sector innovation generally. Number one, in all systems, feedback plays an incredibly important role. Feedback, especially in evolutionary models of growth and development, feedback is a critical component. But in the public sector, feedback is stymied by a whole series of things: fear, power, hierarchy. We say leaders, whether they're in politics, business, government, wherever, leaders have almost a psychological tendency to surround themselves with people who will tell them what they want to know and not what they need to know. This is almost in all organizations. And this is why in truly innovative organizations, there are people surrounding the leader who will mount what we call constructive challenge, constructive criticism. I've tried to do this in Wales, and our former Prime Minister in Wales said to me, "Stop talking Wales down. Stop rocking the boat." In other words, constructive challenge is sometimes misconstrued as disloyalty. So it's very difficult in our organisation sometimes to speak truth to power. Failure is another big challenge for our public sector organisations. Why? Well, because the public sector is invited to be more experimental, but it's almost as if our compliance culture says, be experimental, be creative, as long as you don't make a mistake. These are the messages that seem to get down to our on the ground. And then, of course, there's learning. Learning is vital, but our public organisations often don't have the time to learn. Why? Because the time afforded to monitoring, evaluation, and revision and reflection is not given. There's not enough time given to these reflective processes. And as I said at the Smart Regions Conference, many managing authorities and many politicians think that monitoring and evaluation is about looking in the past. It's about looking backwards. When I've had to say to many regional bodies, monitoring evaluation is not about looking back. It's about making yourself future fit for moving into the future in a more informed and more intelligent way by drawing the lessons from the past of what worked where, why, over a period of time. That's what monitoring and evaluation. And I think this is closer to Sable's diagnostic monitoring. The challenge for us is, how do you persuade organizations to engage in almost continuous monitoring and evaluation? It's a big challenge, which I hope we can come back to later. So moving quickly on, I want to now try to apply some of these ideas to what we are doing in a more practical setting in terms of our regional innovation policy. As you know, regional innovation policy in Europe is about 26 years old now. Launched, I think, in 1990. I tend to think with the STRIDE program. Some of us are old enough to remember things like this. But we really don't know what the real impact of those regional innovation policies have been. And nor do we know with enough precision what the real impact of our cohesion policy has been, as John Bachtler and his colleagues have said here. And there are many reasons for that. The lack of a strong intervention logic, poorly defined metrics in the regions as to what can be achieved, differential reporting and monitoring. But one factor that's always struck me is over successive cohesion policy programming periods, novelty has increased. And novelty is very challenging for our poor regions. And by novelty, I simply mean innovation. Look at how innovation measures have increased over each successive program. I know it depends how you define innovation-related measures, but we can all agree that regional innovation has increased successively from one programming period to another, and this has been incredibly challenging. It's one thing for our poor regions to build roads. They have the skill sets and the mindsets to build a road, most of them. But when it comes to innovation, it's much more challenging. And then we come to the smart specialisation, which is, one day when the real history of this program, when we've all retired and young students are doing their PhDs, one of the things I think they'll be shocked at is how quickly this idea has moved from the margins to the mainstream, right to the heart of cohesion policy, from being a minor academic idea in the Knowledge for Growth group in Seville, in IPTS, to right at the heart of our cohesion policy. And one of the reasons for that is the marvellous ambassadorial work that Dominic Foray has done. Dominic is a smart guy. He's written this very, very quickly. And he's also a modest guy, as you can see here. It's one of the ideas that has survived the cemetery, he says, because it's been taken up by the Commission. But whereas we tell the regions to engage in SWOT analysis and monitoring, evaluation and revision, it's worth reminding ourselves, we did all this without a single pilot action. So we're monitoring this almost in real time. We're doing what is an old Basque saying, we're building the road as we travel, as we go along, and that's what we're doing. And this is why diagnostic monitoring is so important, to get feedback on what is working where and why, and to feed that back to tweak and pivot our policies so that they are fit for the future and relevant, and they have traction in the regional contexts in which we are working, all of which are very different, of course. So my main argument is going to be this. Smart specialisation is a very, very demanding policy. It's a demanding programme, and it's particularly demanding for our poor regions. Because one of the presumptions in smart specialisation which we didn't. I have to put my hands up here and say mea culpa. I was part of this process, part of the mirror group that helped to draft the first RIS3 guide. But one of the things looking back that maybe we didn't stress enough was how challenging this program is for public bodies, particularly public bodies in lagging regions, because it presumes, I think, a smart state. And you'll all know some of this data, so I'm going to just run through it pretty quickly, and we can come back to it. I've identified 5 or 6 indicators of the smart state here. Let's just remind ourselves what they are, and we can discuss them later if needs be. You know this map very, very well, the Quality of Government Index. The argument basically is that there's a strong correlation between good governance and quality of public service and innovation. And indeed, poor governance correlates with absorptive capacity. You know this. You know this diagram very well. I think from the 6th cohesion report, Katya, it figures in the governance chapter. Just a couple of points quickly before moving on. There's a pretty good correlation between government effectiveness and absorptive capacity. But there are a few idiosyncrasies. Look at these high absorptive rates here for Portugal, Estonia and Lithuania. Highest absorptive rates, but pretty low quality of government. The argument is sometimes, well, they're exceptions because they're small. They were able to absorb because of their scale. But that argument, if it's true, didn't do much to help Malta, for example. So there's a pretty rough correlation here. But the other point is, and this was a point that Walter de Far emphasized when he opened the LSE conference recently, that we have the cohesion policy emphasis over the years has moved from taking absorption rates as an indicator of success to really thinking about ultimate indicators of success in terms of results, jobs, capacity, skills. Absorption rates are an intermediate target, aren't they? The ultimate target is jobs, skills, and development, and so on and so forth. So we can't be obsessed by absorptive capacity, though it is one intermediate indicator. Then we have public sector competence. One indicator of this is how well the public sector can design and deploy its procurement power. We call this the sleeping giant of regional innovation policy. Why? Because it amounts to something like 20% of European GDP. It's the biggest source of irregularities and problems in cohesion policy. It has enormous potential to affect social, economic, environmental change, but that power is stymied. The power of purchase, it's stymied and tempered by the lack of skills and the low political commitment assigned to public procurement. When you think that cities and regions and municipalities are the main bodies that do this in practice, this has enormous potential, but the potential is stymied. Hence we call it the sleeping giant. The entrepreneurial discovery process, as you all know, is the heart of smart specialisation for people like Foray. And it's where the state works alongside firms and universities and so on to identify those key R&I priorities, research and innovation priorities. The problem is that many regions are still locked into the linear model of innovation. That is to say, in the mistaken belief, it's the mistaken belief that more university research inputs leads to more innovation outputs. That's fundamentally what the linear model would have us believe. And there's a big disconnect here, as I suggest, between the academy, which buried the linear model 20 years ago, and reality, where many public sector bodies continue to invest in this model. When the reality is this, that much of the money that goes into our less developed regions for research and innovation ends up in university science silos. And that money doesn't get translated into innovative products and services. It gets trapped in our university science silos. And we have to do much more, it seems to me, to engage those universities, to try to encourage translational research and universities working better with entrepreneurs and their innovation ecosystems. That's the way to overcome the science silos, I think. And then my last indicator of the smart state is the role of elites. Whatever the shortcomings of the RIS3 guide, I think one of the strengths was that it was one of the first regional policy guides ever to take the power of regional elites seriously, to take good governance seriously. Where political leadership exists, that's the most important ingredient, it seems to me, in a regional innovation recipe. But in many, many regions, regional elites are not innovative. They're not dynamic. They are much closer to what we might call extractive institutions, as it's been put by the famous book Why Nations Fail, for example. So, to my mind, and I said this at Walter's LSE conference, the most difficult question in cohesion policy is, what do we do about non-performing places? Number one, we can say, well, that's how life is, which seems to me to be an intellectual and politically unacceptable position to take. Secondly, we can turn the tap off. Non-performing places don't get any more resources. The performance reserve writ large, you might say. That's politically impossible. Member states wouldn't allow it. So the third option seems to me to be the Barker formula. Fabrizio Barker, the double movement of trying to nurture bottom-up pressures from within the region through civil society, and I give one example of the integrity pacts that are being introduced. And secondly, new conditionalities from the top, from the member state and from the Commission. And at the LSE conference, I spoke to Barker and we discussed this, and we both agreed that the Commission could and should use its resources in a more conditional way. I know this steps on the toes of subsidiarity, but there's no harm in the Commission saying, on the basis of the evidence, we think this should happen in such a member state. I'll come back to that argument in the context of Romania, one of the lagging region projects that we're involved with. So these are the options available to member states and the Commission. How do we put pressure on non-performing places? Because it's not acceptable for us to do nothing. The public sector needs to be brought into this frame in a much smarter way, it seems to me. And the final point here about third wave innovation, even entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley are realizing now that as the internet moves into sectors which have hitherto been low adopters, health, education, energy, transport, one of the common denominators in all those big sectors, which account for 30-40% of jobs in every local economy, one of the common denominators in all those sectors is the large role of the public sector. And therefore, smart entrepreneurs know they have to start to strike more innovative partnerships with public sector bodies, whether it's in education, health, energy, or whatever. Because the public sector is not going away in these sectors. This is the third wave of innovation. And this is the biggest challenge as I come to an end with these slides. Cohesion policy trends over the long term, the shift from heavy infrastructure to innovation, the shift from absorption to results and performance, puts big pressure on our lagging regions. And the key ingredients, it seems to me, for results and performance in our regions, number one, the quality of our institutions, and secondly, the caliber of our networks. These are the two critical things that we need for success. The challenge is this: that the status of the public sector, the status of the state, has such a low legitimacy in Southern Europe and in Central and Eastern Europe. What can we do about that? Well, very, very quickly, in the 5 minutes or so that I have left, the Lagging Region project, which some of you will be aware of, focuses on 2 different types of lagging region in Southern Europe and in Central and Eastern Europe. And in Romania, there's 2 lagging region focus. We've been working on our Smart Spec project, as Peter mentioned earlier, in Northeast Romania. And what's emerged out of that case study in Northeast Romania was shocking and compelling, because I have to admit I had zero knowledge of Romania before we started this project. But what I found, I was told this is the poorest region in the European Union. This is the poorest of the poor. That's how it was presented to me. And yet in the region, there was a lot of dynamism going on. The Regional Development Agency was very active, well connected. It's the only Romanian agency region with an office in Brussels, which helps with its intelligence and its feedback back to the region. It designed a good smart specialisation strategy. The problem is the central government didn't pay any heed of it. Smart specialisation in Romania was a national affair, drawn up by, quote, the usual suspects in central government, heavily based on science and technology. All the local knowledge in Northeast Romania was absorbed in the Regional Development Agency, which was effectively cut out of the process. Therefore, going back to what I said about Sable's experimental governance and its assumptions about devolved capacity, there's a lack of regional powers in the region, which means that whatever the actors have learnt, they're not empowered to implement, because the powers exist somewhere else. Another example would be the role of the universities. There are smart universities in Northeast Romania, but their gaze is entirely on Bucharest. They have no gaze locally. Their gaze is entirely on the centre. Why? Well, because as one of the rectors said to me, because that's where the science and technology budgets are decided. In other words, there's no incentive for these institutions, the smartest institutions in the region, there's no incentive for them to engage and connect locally. So we have to try to create a new set of incentives. And then there's the role of the European Commission. I've said to many of my friends in DG REGIO, why can't you at least nudge, in that language of nudging and behavioural economics, why can't you try to nudge central authorities to devolve a little more power to their regions? Because without that devolution of power, all the other stuff doesn't work. Why? Because you can't expect regional stakeholders to learn things and then tell them, but you've got no power to implement what you've learnt. So devolution must go along with smart specialisation, it seems to me. The projects that you're doing in lagging regions, I would really highly recommend them in terms of scaling up and scaling out. I know they're small projects, peer-to-peer learning mechanism. It's a small project, but when you talk to Northeast Romania stakeholders, they said they've learnt a hell of a lot from their alliance with Northern Netherlands provinces. It's really worked. It's been innovative, it's been flexible, and they can't praise it enough. So something's going right there that we need to acknowledge and scale up. Then there's the HES project, Higher Education for Smart Specialisation. Another good project which is paying small, modest dividends, but needs to be scaled up. But the point is, these good projects are not being given the traction they deserve because their local actors are not empowered to work on them. So, I'm trying to suggest that as well as all the hard policies, regulation, financial instruments, procurement power, the hard powers open to our regional administrations, there's also something that we might call soft power. And this soft power, in my experience, can be very, very effective especially in an age of austerity when budgets are under pressure. We call it the convening power to broker new networks in the region, to bring universities together with entrepreneurs, to focus on the possibilities in the region, and then the curating capacity to foster inter-regional networks, like the Vanguard Initiative, for example, an important learning experience for us to see if our regional alliances can move from what Vanguard entrepreneurs say, we need to move from contact to contract. That's the key thing, not just making contacts with each other, but moving from contact to contract. Because this is the thing I think about smart states. When they're involved in partnerships and networks with other partners, universities, firms, technology institutes, other partners value them for their competence in the network, not their status in the hierarchy. The fact that you're the top of your hierarchy in a regional innovation system doesn't cut it with smart people. You are valued for your contribution to the problem solving of the projects in hand. And that's what I call the curating capacity of a regional government. And these soft skills are not well understood by our managing authorities, it seems to me. So my final slide is this. Going right back to Adam Smith, I think there's an argument in Adam Smith, I know he doesn't use these words, of a smart state. That is to say, a judicious government which is behaving in an enlightened way, whether it's about taxes, justice, security, and allowing for this natural course of things, allowing for the natural entrepreneurial energies of people who the world over want to better their own condition. That's an energy we need to harness, it seems to me. The RIS process offers so much, but it's stymied in practice, in my view, because of the problems of feedback learning and the fear of failure. But shrinking the state is counterproductive, because in all the sectors that are looming large in our economies, as I said, health, education, energy, transport, whatever it is, dignified elder care, all these sectors, the common denominator is the large role played by the public sector. And the public sector can either foster innovation or frustrate it. And we need to help them to foster it. Thank you very much.